digger, listener, runner, prince with a swift warning, from a chance in the world. Literary nonfiction by Steve Pemberton. All the world will be your enemy, prince of 1,000 enemies, and whenever they catch you, they will kill you. But first, they must catch you. Digger, listener, runner, prince with a swift warning, be cunning and full of tricks. Richard Adams, Watership Down. I settled into a routine at the house on Arnold Street, to the degree one can ever become comfortable with monsters who disguise themselves as human beings. This is what they were to me, real-life boogeymen whose origins and intentions I could never fathom. Children rarely ask where monsters come from, or how they came to be. Children simply accept them as a fact of life, something to be dealt with, the way you deal with any other childhood fear. One way I dealt with these monsters was to become a thief, and a very good one at that. My devious plots were elaborate, complete with escape routes and explanations if I were ever to get caught. I obsessed over the things I stole, and no matter how much I managed to get, I always tried to steal more. Once I stole something, I would stare at it, wondering how best I could hide it or preserve it. But I didn't steal just anything. I was fixated on one thing: food. At 7 years old, I weighed just 40 pounds, a fact the Robinsons explained away by saying I had tapeworms. To avoid going hungry, I had to be creative to outwit them. Nearly every morning of my days with the Robinsons, I would awake and immediately try to determine how I was going to get food to hide in the basement. It took me a while to learn what to steal. My first foray into the art of thievery was a huge block of government-rationed cheese that Willie had hustled. I hid it in the basement and sneaked away one afternoon, ready to feast, only to find the mice that roamed the cellar had already beaten me to it. After that, I placed my thieving eye on the unlabeled silver cans of peanut butter Willie brought home. I was confident that the enterprising mice couldn't chew through the metal. I wasn't usually that picky. I would eat whatever scraps I could get my hands on. If it wasn't moving, then it was fair game. Whenever they went grocery shopping, I had to unload the bags. I would scan the bags quickly to see what was in them and hide the one with the most goodies underneath the car. When the coast was clear, I would take the bag and dash to the cellar, where I would squirrel it away. From time to time, they would realize that they had come up a bag or two short and would fume at the person who had bagged their groceries. They never figured out it was me. The joy of outsmarting the Robinsons became almost as sweet as the food I stole. Almost. Another very important way of coping was to immerse myself in books. When precisely I began reading, I cannot say. There was no signature moment, at least early on. But I imagine I discovered books as part of going to school. Books for me were what the ocean is to the fearless explorer, deep and mysterious, boundless and soothing. I loved the smell of books, the feel of their weight in my hands, the rustle of the pages as I turned them, the magnificent illustrations on the covers that promised hidden treasures within. Like food, books were hard for me to come by. The Robinsons never bought me any, Robinson Rule number 10, and thwarted every attempt I made to get more. When I did bring home a book from the school library, I had to ask if I could read, Robinson Rule number 11. If I were caught reading without permission, a merciless beating would follow, Robinson Rule number 12. When permission was granted, it was granted begrudgingly, and only under the condition that I read in the cellar. I was never allowed to keep books upstairs, Robinson Rule number 13. Nor could I read in their presence. Robinson Rule number 14. The cellar was cold, musty, and dank. Its walls tossed off long shadows in the dim light offered by a single swaying bulb. I frequently heard the mice clawing and scratching in the walls. The cellar was storage space for many of the home's utilities: washing machine, dryer, hot water, and oil furnaces, but also for many of the things the Robinsons had no further use for, like broken furniture that didn't stand, ancient preserves no longer fit to be eaten, old clothes that had gone out of style. These abandoned items had served their purpose, but the Robinsons held on to them, believing that someday someone foolish enough to value them would come along and take them off their hands. To the Robinsons, the cellar was precisely where I belonged. Amid all the clutter, I fashioned a makeshift reading space composed of mildewy clothes, torn pillows, and old box springs. I positioned the space directly under the stairs because, that way, I would be able to hear anyone coming down, and my hearing was finely tuned. I knew the stride pattern of each member of the family. Betty shuffled, Reggie had longer steps, and Willie's plodding was the easiest to detect, for he often walked with his oak cane. When they approached the cellar door, I would scramble to hide my book and stash of food. I kept a jug of water to wash away the peanut butter smell on my breath, a lesson I learned when Willie nearly caught me. If I had ever been caught reading down there with my moldy stash of hoarded food, I would have paid a dear price. I loved the cellar, finding it a welcome refuge from the Robinson rules. Yet it was not my favorite place to read, at least not during the warmer months. Across from the Robinsons' house, right next to Fuller's paint store, was Mrs. Blake's house. Alongside her yard was a small retaining wall. A large oak tree hung over the area, so large that it kept half the block in shade. The wall itself was no more than a few feet high and craggy, as if hewn from the side of a mountain, except for a single, smooth, square piece of rock at the wall's northern end. Once my chores were done and I had received permission, I would take my favorite book, go to that shaded haven, and lose myself in my latest mystery, none of which seemed as great as the mystery of where I had come from. Nearly every summer day you would find me sitting on that wall, accompanied by squirrels playing in the trees, as well as the occasional ant that tried to make my sneaker its home. I was never more at peace during my childhood than when I sat there. I loved the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves of the large oak, the smell of freshly cut grass brought on by neighborhood lawnmowers, the cacophony of birds that twittered as they flew by, the bumblebees that hovered by my head before moving on to more interesting things. This was my sanctuary, the place where I felt the most alive and the safest. One summer afternoon when I was about 8 years old, I looked up from my perch atop my reading wall to see a woman strolling down Chancery Street toward me. It was a neighbor, Mrs. Levin. I had seen her on many occasions walking to Sunnybrook Farms, the neighborhood grocery store. She was a small woman with dark hair pulled away from her face, although now, looking at her up close for the first time, I noticed the first signs of gray. Mrs. Levin was plainly dressed as always, and moved at a casual pace, thoroughly enjoying her walk. She often waved and smiled at the Robinsons, but nothing more than that. From time to time her husband joined her. He was slightly taller, a balding man who wore red suspenders over a white T-shirt. They were Jewish, and the only reason I knew that was because as soon as they were out of earshot, Betty or Willie would fling anti-Semitic remarks at their backs. For quite some time, I thought they said Jewels instead of Jews. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out why the Robinsons thought something as precious as jewels would be such bad people. Now I looked down, careful not to make any eye contact that would initiate a conversation. Robinson Rule number 15. The walkway alongside the Blake home was not paved, and I could hear the crunching of Mrs. Levin's footsteps on the gravel as she neared. As I so often did with strangers, I hoped that she would walk on by and pay me no attention. But that's not what happened. Her white tennis shoes, scuffed ever so lightly around the toe, stopped right in front of me, and though I was not afraid, I still swallowed hard. "What are you reading there?" she asked. I looked up from the pages and showed her the cover of my Encyclopedia Brown mystery. Leroy Brown, Encyclopedia to his friends, was a boy detective who often sat at the dinner table helping his dad, the chief of police in the fictional town of Idaville, solve cases that had baffled the department. "You like mysteries?" she asked. "Oh, yes, ma'am," I said, making the conversation far longer than the Robinson rules dictated. "I really like how you get a chance to figure out the clues for yourself. Now, if I remember, weren't you reading this book last week?" It puzzled me how she could have known that. "Yes, ma'am, but when I finish a book, I go back to the beginning and start all over again." "I see." She said nothing more and ambled on toward the store. But I still remember the long look she sent in the direction of my house on Arnold Street. Later that evening, there was a knock at the door. I was in the pantry washing dishes when Betty answered. A voice I immediately recognized asked, "Is Steve here? I have something I would like to give him." It was Mrs. Levin. I grabbed for the dish rag, began drying my hands, and heard Betty say, "I can give them to him." But Mrs. Levin was insistent. "If it's okay, I would like to give him these myself." There was a pause. "Stevie," Betty said, the sweet melodic voice and use of a nickname telling me that she was on stage. I came around the corner much faster than I should have, but my eavesdropping was either missed or ignored. "You remember me?" Mrs. Levin asked. I nodded my head yes. "Well, I thought you might like these." In her arms was a brown open-ended box, but I could not see what was in it. She lowered it, and I could barely believe my eyes. Inside the box were stacks of books of different thicknesses and colors, their covers bright and promising. "Whoa," I said. "These," she said, "are for the boy who likes to read." "Thank you, ma'am," I said, barely able to take my eyes off the box. "You're welcome," she said, smiling. And with that, she left. She was barely out of earshot before Betty's voice boomed. "Take those books downstairs. I bet I never see them up here." "Yes, ma'am, right now, ma'am," I stammered. I feared that she would make me throw them away. Nothing I write can accurately capture the power and timeliness of the gift Mrs. Levin gave me that day. Though I did not know it at the time, several years earlier, when I was 1.5 years old, a babysitter had written, "Drop Steve off at the latest family his mother is boarding him out to." He cried his heart out. This little boy doesn't have a chance in the world. Others believed this as well, especially those to whose care I was entrusted. I sensed it in their sidelong glances and empathetic shakes of the head. Their eyes sang what their tongues would not. "You are beyond repair." I had beaten my fists against this fate as long as I could. Now, frequently starved and beaten almost daily, failed and abandoned by the institutions tasked with my care, and waiting for a family that was never going to come for me, I was beginning to lose my desperate battle with the Robinsons. Caseworkers at the time described me as tense, nervous, and anxious. What was really unfolding was something far more damaging, something they never looked hard enough to see. I had begun to resign myself to this fate, to accept I was to be the Robinsons' prisoner, and that their world would be the only one I would ever know. But the characters that unfolded in those books and the worlds they lived in showed me a different life, a future far beyond the pain of the house on Arnold Street. I learned that not everyone lived the way I did, that most people came from intact homes that offered joy and laughter, freedom and exploration, promise and possibility. And because of what I read, I developed the ridiculously absurd notion that one day I, too, could have a life like the ones I read about. At every opportunity, I would steal down to the cellar to dive into my cardboard chest of hidden treasures, planting myself right in the middle of those adventures. I became a fearless explorer, a brilliant scientist, and a master riddle solver. I went to the depths of the ocean with Captain Nemo and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, stood right by Howard Carter's side as he discovered the tomb of King Tutankhamun, and landed on the moon with the crew of Apollo 11. I unlocked more riddles with Boy Detective Encyclopedia Brown, and joined forces with Alfred Hitchcock and the 3 investigators to solve even greater mysteries. My books became my shelter, protecting me as the Robinson slings and arrows rained overhead. And I returned my books' protection by guarding them the way most children guard their teddy bears. As a little boy, I was mystified when bookworms burrowed into their pages and crushed when a basement flood destroyed several of them. Mrs. Levin's books gave me something else that I did not fully appreciate until many years later, a model for dealing with the Robinsons. It came from my favorite book, Watership Down, a novel I would read over and over again. Published in 1972 and written by the British author Richard Adams, this book tells the tale of a band of resilient rabbits searching for a new home. Led by the small but exceedingly clever Hazel, these rabbits encountered many obstacles in their search. One of their first challenges was one I knew all too well. They encounter a warren of contented rabbits, a home that seems to be exactly what the group is looking for. Yet they learn that this new home is not at all what it appears to be, and that it is, in fact, a cleverly crafted rabbit farm intended to ensnare them. The rabbits escape the farm and often resort to trickery in their pursuit of a new home. Deception may seem unprincipled, but it is absolutely necessary if Hazel and his group of rabbits are to survive, especially when their very existence is threatened by another group of rabbits, the Effrefrans, and their evil leader, General Woundwort. There comes a time when deception is not enough, and the group must take a stand against General Woundwort, although they know it will likely cost them their lives. I found kinship in the rabbits of Watership Down. They became my childhood friends, the only ones I was allowed to have, and I could cite their names at the drop of a hat: Fiver, Bigwig, Pipkin, and Blackberry. My friends were smart, fast, elusive, and resourceful. Their very survival was predicated on their ability to sense danger. Though confronted by bigger foes, they outwitted them. Perhaps most important, I saw the rabbits as fighters, their combativeness driven by a certainty that they could create a different and better life for themselves. For Hazel and his followers, it was never a question of if they would find a home. It was simply a matter of when. Over the years, Mrs. Levin stopped by many times to deliver a new box of books. In my quiet moments of reflection, I often wonder what might have become of me had not this kind woman lit a pathway for me through the suffocating darkness of the house on Arnold Street. The Robinsons never refused her request, perhaps because they knew that would raise suspicions. But had they known those books would sow the seeds of my rebellion, They would have torched them the minute Mrs. Levin was out of their sight.